So it turns out that rather than the story world being dependent on the object world, it might be the other way around. The object world is dependent on the story world, and that implies, at least to some degree, that the story world is actually more real, whatever that means. And then I told you that, well, the real problem of life isn't so much what do you do when you're around things that you understand. The real problem of life is what do you do when you encounter something you can't conceptualize. And I think a good recent example of that was the bombing of the World Trade Towers, which people were compelled to watch over and over and over and over. And if you ask someone, well, what is it that you're watching, they would say, well, I'm watching the World Trade Towers fall down. But then you might say, well, why are you watching it over and over? And they would say something like, well, I can't believe it. I can't believe it's happening. And what does that mean? It means something like, whatever it is that's happening here, whatever's being blown apart, exceeds my ability to model, and as a consequence I have to expose myself to it again and again and again and again to try to understand what's falling. Like, what's falling exactly? Is it just the towers? Is it 20,000 people? Is it the financial system of the US? Is it the stability of the Western world? Is it the beginning of World War III? Or, as the former CIA director just mentioned in the US, the beginning of World War IV? What is it exactly that you're looking at when something happens that you don't understand? And then you say, well, how do you react to that? And it turns out that you react mostly with your body, not with your mind, not with your perceptual systems, not with your thoughts, but with your emotions and your body. And that means you sweat and you panic and you feel depressed and you feel hurt and you feel ashamed and you're prepared for a catastrophe, which is stress. And all that's basically non-cognitive. And what that kind of means is that when you encounter something you don't understand, the first manner in which you conceive of it is embodied, emotional, physical. Way before you develop up an object representation or cognitive representation, you may not ever get it. Like an event like that, or a worse event, can throw someone into a tailspin that's so extreme that they never get out of it. So you see, for example, sometimes, and this is more true among elderly people, if their spouse dies, the probability that they'll die in the next year, say from a heart attack or something like that, increases substantially. Why is that? It's because their conceptual frame was so dependent on the existence of their spouse, say someone they've lived with for 25 years, that the anxiety and uncertainty caused by their anomalous disappearance, their death, is so extreme that it sends their body into a physiological state that's basically unbearable, and that does them in. And when you start to understand what having your preconceptions rattled really means, then you also start to understand why people are so motivated to protect their ideological territory, right? Because ideological territory, that's how you see the world. That's your story. And you can't have your fundaments rattled all the time because it throws everything into chaos, and that puts you in this terrible, panicky, cortisol-ridden, stressful state that's really hard on you physically. So we know, for example, that if you're in a state where you're chronically exposed to threat or punishment, which is the case in depression, say, you produce a lot of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and cortisol is toxic. So the more of it you produce, the more you kill off your hippocampal cells, and you really need them because they're key to memory. You do in your immunological system. There's all sorts of negative side effects of cortisol poisoning, increased incidence of cardiovascular disease, heightened rate of cancer. Plus, it's just no fun, right? It's the worst thing that can possibly happen to you, essentially. If something unknown happens to you and blows your frame of reference, right, knocks you for a loop, sends you to the underworld, however you want to construe it, that's really going to upset your bandwagon and throw you into a state that you do virtually anything to avoid. But by the same token, there is a possibility that inside that chaotic mess, there's something you really need. And what's the logic there? Well, the logic is something like this. When you look at the world, you only see a fragment of it. And that's good, because it's pretty overwhelming, and a fragment's generally more than enough. But all the information that you've ever gathered in your entire life to build yourself out of and to make your life stable has come as a consequence of your ability to explore what you don't understand. And that's an unlimited capacity, right? No matter how much you explore and how much information you gather, there's always the possibility that there's way more information out there, and that means if you have a problem and you see that it's a problem, even though that's frightening, it's also a gateway into a domain of possibility, and the possibility is this richly informative background that could in principle provide you with any answer you need. And then you can think one more thing. The old gods, Mars, say, the god of war, Venus, the god of love, they're all internalized for us, right? We know that anger is a psychological state and that love is a psychological state. But if we look at our great religious traditions, Christianity, say, or Buddhism, just to take two as an example, we still have this notion that what these figures represent is something external. Well, you might say, how primitive, right? Just as primitive as the idea that the god of war is something external is the idea that this sort of figure is supposed to be something external. It's supposed to be something embodied, right? It's a story about the nature of individual moral responsibility.